This is my outfit for the office Christmas party. Just one thing missing: a black velour tie. Hunting around the charity shops, I found this tie and this lovely black dress. I have no idea how to properly sew a tie, so I'm going to deconstruct this one and reverse engineer it. Having opened up the back stitch, I find this wool batting. The tie itself is made up of 3 sections, and the points are lined. You can see me here having a proper look at the tip of the lining. There's a line of stitching running at right angles to the seam that I don't understand. I decide to look up some guides, and this is how to add a tipping and get a margin. In this sample, I'm using much more workable fabric. The patterned fabric is the shell, and the white is the tipping. I've taken off half my usual seam allowance from around the tipping. Right sides together, I line up one edge and sew towards the point, stopping before the end. I then line up the other edge and sew to match the other side. There should be an excess of fabric on the shell. I fold the work in half with the shell on the outside, then sew from the end of the previous seam at right angles to the fold. I cut off excess seam allowance at the tip and the corners and turn the sewing out. I then press the seams and we have a perfect end to a tie. Shh, it's just a sample. On my project, I have all the bits and take them to the ironing board to press them flat. I take the back out of the dress and use this for the main tie panel. I know I'm supposed to cut this on the bias, which is handy, as this is the only way I can fit the piece onto the fabric I have. The other 2 panels, the neck and the tail, are fitted onto the scrap around this cut, and I use the dress lining for the tippings. Both fabrics are super stretchy, so to make things easier, I add fusible lining to all the seam edges, and start to construct the tie. Somewhere along the way I had flipped the tail pattern, so bear with me as I quickly remake it. I add the tipping to both ends, but this doesn't go as well as in the sample. To close up the back, I'll use a slip stitch. I lay out the batting and press over the raw edge on one side of the shell before closing over, pressing and pinning the back. At this stage, the tie has ended up a little narrower than the original, and I'm happy with that, but the seam has wandered over to one side in the process. The last thing to do is to position the keeper loop, and I'm just going to use the one from the donor tie, but with the seam misaligned, I'll have to get creative when it comes to tacking it in place. I settle down in front of the TV to hand stitch the back closed. Again, I'm using a slip stitch or blind hem stitch. I've covered that in detail before in the Learning to Tailor video. While I'm doing that, let's make a matching pocket square. Using one of my pocket squares as a template, I cut out a piece of the dress, including some of the lace detailing. I'll be using the same process for the tipping to get a margin around all edges of the pocket square. I cut a square of lining to match and reduce it by my usual seam allowance on 2 joining edges. I add interfacing, except on the lace, and line up the panels right sides together and sew along the edge, leaving gaps at the corners. I match up the next edge and sew it together, and the third. On the fourth, I sew twice, leaving a gap in the middle for bagging out. I then sew up all the tips, matching up the ends of the seams as best I can. This one kinda got away from me. I can now bag out and press the sort of square into the best shape I can manage before I hand sew the gap with a slip stitch. And this is the finished garments. It only took me a couple of hours to make this tie, and it's exactly what I wanted. It's ridiculous and overly dressy, but that was kind of the point. I should admit that I did the sample after I had made the tie and learned a lot in that process. As with anything, practice helps, and I could probably do a better job on the tips second time around. I should have trimmed down the width of the blade to get that narrower look, so that I could have centred the back seam and avoid this horror show with the keeper loop. I'm missing a bar tack at the ends, which is encouraged to strengthen the slip stitch, but that can be added later ahead of its next outing. The pocket square is just bad. Hopefully no one will notice. This was a really easy, quick and cheap project, especially considering the price of bespoke ties. Now I've done this one, I can see me continuing to make ties ad hoc for any event where I need to get all dressy. Thanks very much for getting this far, it's always appreciated. If you're enjoying my little sewing channel, why not subscribe?